Hello, everyone. This is Edward Tahmizian. I'm now the Vice President and Social Media Manager of Internet Infidels Board, and today I'm going to be interviewing the great and legendary Dr. Richard Carrier. Thanks for being on again, sir.
Oh
Three-time
yeah, glad to be here.
charm. Yep, and then also wanted to say this is the mythicist trifecta I've now attained because I've interviewed David Fitzgerald, Robert M. Price, and Richard Carrier. And Richard
Yeah.
Carrier times at that. And David Fitzgerald twice, one with him and one with him and his wife. It was cool. We talked about beer and stuff in his science fiction novels.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
him and his wife are really great writers.
they're really successful as fiction authors. Definitely. I would also recommend seeing if Raphael Lataster will do an interview because he's the one who published the second peer-reviewed book arguing that Jesus' mythicism is plausible. So because people often forget, like they think, oh, it's only Richard Carrier. No, there's two peer-reviewed books coming to the same conclusion, and Lataster is the one on that. So he would be. I don't know if he's doing interviews, but it's worth looking into.
All right, I'll look into that. Alrighty, so today we're going to start off with the problem of evil. And if anyone hasn't read my scholarly paper that's been published, it was published in 2020, and I argue that the origin of evil has to do with God. And to make a very brief presentation of what I say in my paper, I argue that a lot of people talk about, the free will defense. They say, well, the solution to the problem of evil is people need to just use their free will to do good, and God has to make people with libertarian freedom, or else, it's not a true commandment he's giving them if they don't have the moral freedom to accept it or reject it. And I argue, well, you have to go more in depth than free will. Like, why do people use their free will? Because they experience temptation. And what I argue that is, Adam and Eve would have had to have felt, an internal motivation to sin via, a sinful disposition. And I argue that, dispositions come from your nature. And I argue that, God would have to create them with a disposition to sin.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then
for people who don't know, like we're talking about your paper, it's on the secular web for people who want to find it.
Oh, yeah.
And it has a two-stage argument. The one is, of course, you start with the easy argument, which is the Calvinist one, right? It's like, if you're like a Calvinist and you think there is no libertarian free will, it's all causally determined, then there's no escaping your argument. Like, you're just full on right. Like God caused all evil. God is responsible for all evil.
Yeah,
there's no way to get around.
We'll talk about that later.
Right, and then, but as you said, like in the U.S., what we deal with mostly is evangelical Christianity, which does not accept the Calvinist view generally. They're the ones who promulgate this free will defense, right? But that doesn't hold either, like you're saying. So you have to have the inclination, right? It's very much reminds me of.
That's not your fault, yeah.
Yeah, the homophobes, right? These Christian homophobic preachers who go that homosexuality is a choice, and they'll often be going like, "Oh, it's a delicious choice that you have to resist." And I'm like, I think you're gay.
It's like you have to be.
Everybody who's not gay. It's not like they don't have this urge to go have gay sex, right?
Yeah, they have to be motivated.
So this is the thing: is like, why would you even install the desire to do something evil? That's inherently bad design, and that's a choice that God made in terms of the way he built people. The existence of sociopathy is an example. That is a genetic disorder.
Yeah.
It's triggered by certain environments that when you have a certain parental environment plus the genes, you get a sociopath. And no one gets free will choice over their parents, right? So this is like God has set things up even to create sociopaths. So there's no reason for that. Like, that's horribly bad design. And most of the worst crimes, from war crimes to murder and so on, most of them are committed by sociopaths. Like our prisons are full of sociopaths. And some of the worst things that happen, like at the corporate level, there's an inordinate number of sociopaths as CEOs. It's like 2 to 3 times the rate in the general population. So, so here's an example of like God is deliberately engineering people to be like and it would be easy to just take that away, to say, oh, remove the genetic disorder, remove the disease.
Yeah, just give them an inclination to good action.
Make someone ungay, like most people, right? You can make them not want to challenge the words of God or whatever it is, right? You just as you point out, is like you just remove the inclination. You're just not. I mean, you could freely choose it.
You're just not motivated. Yeah.
Why do you care? Why would you want to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so your argument is sound. I think that, and it's it's a good explanation of it. Like I've tried to explain this to people before I read your paper, and I think your paper is a good explanation of that. Because I make the same point in a lot of my writings. It's like the free will defense doesn't really make any logical sense. There are a lot of other problems with it, like, but you're focused on one of the problems with it. But that is one of the reasons it doesn't really work.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into that later on, talk about the difference between natural and moral freedom. And just to give a quick statement, some Christians will come in and say, well, it's not that God created Adam with a disposition to sin. Like they'll say, with secret knowledge in the fruit, there's nothing wrong with that. They had what's known as we can call it a metaphysically good inclination. It's like a morally neutral inclination, like ice cream, like, which is the morally right decision, to eat or not to eat? Well, it's morally neutral. So they'll say, well, he just had a morally neutral disposition to secret knowledge, and then he used his free will to eat of that. And that clearly doesn't work, even according to the Bible, because think about it, Jesus was morally perfect, and he didn't have the moral freedom to sin, and he had morally neutral motivations like Adam. Actually, his were a lot more tough, had he not eaten bread for 40 days, and he still can't sin. So how do you explain that? So the deal is, because he doesn't have a disposition to sin, it's its own thing. Like what he'll say is, okay, well, eating the bread after 40 days, I'm really hungry. Dang, I'm motivated to eat. Like he feels hunger, but he's like, okay, well, this would involve lying against Yahweh, saying, because I promised I would never break his commandments, but I have nothing carnal in me motivating me to rebellion or a lie. He has none of that. He only has a disposition to holy action to tell the truth. So that's why he can't, sin. So a morally neutral disposition, doesn't give you an explanation. To be a moral being, you need a moral motivation, an evil inclination to do evil, a holy disposition to do holy. And I kind of go into that in my paper too. So, that's the deal. They can't go to that either. And then then there's the deal of like, it's like even like the great Calvinist theologian R.C. Sproul, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he said like, if God created Adam with a disposition to sin, you have a terrible painting of the character of God, because he would have ingrained in man an evil disposition and then punished them, thought him deemed fit to be sent to hell forever, going off of that which he put in him, and blah, 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 blah. And that just, if he can inspire wickedness in them, he can inspire wickedness in us. And then so there's that right there. And did you want anything to say to that before I go into
and you also point out in your article, which is a point that people often make, but it's nice to see it all organized in one place like this, but is the God thing. So like, does God have free will?
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
So this is a problem for Christian theology. You either have to deny it. Now, if you deny that God has free will, now you've also admitted that free will isn't morally important anymore. So why does God give anyone free will? If the most morally perfect person doesn't have free will, then
you're right.
It's actually causing evil to produce free will. But on the other hand, so here's the other horn of the dilemma. You can jump over there, which is that God does have free will. And then as you point out, like, well, then why doesn't God sin? Why doesn't God do evil? Well, because of his dispositions. And it's like, right? So you explicitly point out, like, why doesn't he just give why doesn't he give divine dispositions to Adam, who has, he's the image of God? Why not make him the image of God?
In order to be in his image, he'd have to be morally perfect, just like his creator. Because Christians are like, if to be in God's image, you have to have libertarian freedom. I'm like, God does not have libertarian freedom. Like, and
even if he did, this is the thing, is that even if he did, your dispositions argument, it negates that argument. So it's still the same way. Like the reason, if God has libertarian free will, it's still the fact that he has moral dispositions as to why he freely chooses what he does, which means he could install that in anyone. And I made similar arguments, not specifically on this, but in regard to mind-brain dysteleology, which is an argument like there's a lot of stuff about how our reasoning works and how our brain works that are just really bad design that would be easily solved by making our mind work the same way God's does. First of all, like, to give you just one example of many, it's like,
sure.
Well, you can't shoot a bullet through it. Right? You can't distort it with drugs. You can't. It's if you have a mind that's a disembodied mind, it can't be physically harmed, and thus always works correctly. Why would you not give people a brain that always works correctly? Why would you give them this big, heavy, complex, nutrition-consuming, easily
make them like angels?
Angels. Yeah, and this is also what Paul says about our resurrection bodies, right? Like why do we have to wait for those? Why weren't those given to us from the beginning, right? And this ties back to your point, which is that God is responsible for making these choices. Like within the context of the Christian theory, God had to have chosen to basically corrupt Adam, right? Like he had to have made the choice to make Adam a corrupt soul rather than a pure soul. And so there's no way around that, right? Like God is responsible for that. You can't get him off the hook. There's no argument you can give, and as you go through the attempts to get rid of it, you just can't. Free will defense doesn't work, and so that I think you've got it pretty well nailed in there.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, and because some parts of the Bible seem to imply that God's will is immutable. So, I mean, in other words, he has free will, but it can be known as compatibilistic free will, where he can only willingly do one action, and given the same set of scenarios, he couldn't have willed otherwise. I know he's that way in the moral sense, but he could also be that way in the morally neutral sense. Like maybe he could have only created this universe, so there's that deal too.
Yeah. It's worth remembering, of course, that the Bible is written by people who don't know anything about the free will compatibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So their choice of vocabulary and things, you can't necessarily just link it to metaphysics, exactly. Right? There's a lot of different ways to interpret the semantics of a biblical passage. Because you can say, for instance, God can't decide differently, but the reason is not because he lacks libertarian free will, but the reason is because he has no disposition to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So your own disposition argument, like Nick can reinterpret that as well, and it fits the language, etc. So yeah, they really can't make that case. But even if they did, as you point out, it doesn't help. It's two horns of the dilemma. They die on both, and there's no way around it.
And there's a predicament because it's like undoubtedly, according to the Bible, angels were a better creation than humans even before the fall because they're not subject to the laws of physics. They don't have a brain that can make fallible computations like a man, and it's like they can fly in the air, blah 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 blah. And it looks like some of them were even morally superior because just think about it, how come some of them didn't fall? Maybe it's because God gave them more of a holy disposition. I'm sure even some Christians would argue that, and some Christians like Roman Catholics and even the Calvinist theologian who is arguably more prominent than John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards himself said, well, God can't, he isn't morally obliged to make people morally perfect right off the bat because it'd be too great of a dignity. He would, that'd be giving the creature too much, so to speak. Got to give them a little thorn in the side and a little disposition to send to kind of show them how they're in their place.
Yeah, that's
horrible. And you go to hell forever for a single crime. But it's like, it's only in a state of retribution that God is always so obliged to give people grace to always allow them to surmount any and all temptation after they pass the covenant of works. But he's under no obligation to initially do that. And then think about it. In Edwards' view, I'll just say this.
Baby. Think about this. You have a baby. And then you think, oh, this baby's too perfect. I'm going to break all its limbs. And you think, like, that's basically what you're talking about, right? Is that God chooses to cripple people because there's no way you can argue that's good. Like, that's obviously evil. Right? So that doesn't escape the problem. That just recreates the problem. And a lot of Christian apologetics does that. I've encountered this a lot where they try to explain why God would allow something and say, what your explanation is just proving my point. Like, is you're actually establishing that God is evil and making evil decisions and causing evil in the world. I mean, that's my point. So you're not really arguing against me there. And I think that's an example of that.
Yeah. And it's like, and then there's the issue of even allegedly, if we take into consideration that he doesn't owe people moral perfection off the bat and can give them, moral crutches to, not have, Robbie Thickett's blurred lines happening between the creator and the creation so that those creation can know their place and know how great he is. It's like, how much can he give them a downgrade? Because, like, here's the deal with Calvinists. Yeah. They don't believe that even Adam and Eve had libertarian free will. And I mean, even the London Baptist Confession of Faith doesn't imply that either. I think there's some issues with interpreting the London Baptist because it says, God gave Adam and Eve liberty and they weren't driven by necessity to do good or evil, but it doesn't mean they didn't do actions of necessity. It just means driven of necessity doesn't mean, driven of necessity means they weren't morally perfect, and driven of necessity to do evil doesn't mean, driven of necessity to do evil means they weren't given a post-fall nature. They still did actions of necessity, but it correlated with whatever their greatest desire was. If the temptation was bearable enough to do good, they do good. And if
there's a lot of internal debate within theology that I find too tedious to deal with. Like so like the Calvinists who are against the determinism thing, there are some, right? So that whole debate, I think it's built on angels on the head of a pin, and it's so far divorced from reality that I find it so uninteresting as a philosopher. But it does create problems they're creating for themselves with their self-contradictory theology. It's what throws them on these, and it results in all these elaborate spin-off sects and creeds and stuff. these desperate attempts to keep the religion true while dealing with the contradictions it creates, rather than just leaving.
Yeah, true.
This religion is self-contradictory. It's obviously false. I'm going to go somewhere else. But almost all sectarian divisions are the result of attempting to rescue Christianity from being false through some sort of logical legerdemain, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, because then, that goes into my other point, because it's like, I'll argue that if Adam and Eve did not have libertarian freedom and they had compatibilistic freedom, God would not only be the sufficient cause of their evil inclination, but he'd be the sufficient cause of their evil action. Because that, now you have a problem, because it's like, to summarize briefly, you can only do something if you have a motivation to do it. Well, where do motivations come from? Your nature. So the creator of your nature gives it to you. So it's like when they're being tempted, it's God's the one who's given them, the dispositions to the fruit and the dispositions to find the devil's tempting, persuasive. So it's like in compatibilism, if you can only go off of your greatest desire, though willingly, and God's the efficient cause of your greatest desire, then beyond any and all doubt, he's the efficient cause of your action. That'd make, I mean, that's like C. Samuel Storms argued in this paper. It seems like Edward's system of causal determinism, or even causal determinism himself, would have to make God the efficient cause of sin. That's what he argues, and like other theologians like Clyde Holbrook, John Gershner, argue, hey, it looks like Jonathan Edwards, his protesting withstanding makes God the efficient cause of sin. And it's like, well, now we're gonna have to throw Calvinism or Calvin's deal off that he's just the final cause. Looks like he's the efficient cause. So like, and that's like, so I mean, how ridiculous this is. So imagine an infinite holy being saying, the only thing I owe you is to be the efficient cause of your sin. That's as much as you're owed as a creation.
Right.
Do good's too great of a dignity. Like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, and it all comes from internal contradictions in what the architecture of what they're trying to build, and this comes into like I just recently did an article on Justin Brierly's book Unbelievable, and I've seen today I just published the one on the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments, but earlier, like yesterday or the day before, I published the one on the moral argument. And one of the things he argues in there is just a typical Christian apologetic thing, is that, well, how can you judge God without the standards of morality that come from God, etc.? And I said, well, first of all, what I'm doing is I'm showing a contradiction inherent in your theory. So I don't need a moral foundation. All I need to point out is that your God has to have these moral beliefs. You said he did. But those moral beliefs contradict what he's doing, right? So when I say, like, if God were to deliberately cripple people for some stupid reason, that's evil. I don't need to go find a non-God reason to call that evil. I can say it's evil according to your own God standards. So you have this other dilemma. You either have to admit that the things that God, like what you think are good and evil, are wrong. That the things that we normally think are evil are actually good, and that there's a whole bad course of events down that path once you start admitting that. So they have to actually either abandon their moral values and adopt kind of sociopathic moral values instead, and then claim God endorses them, or they have to admit that their theory of God contradicts the evidence. It doesn't work, and there's no way around this by claiming, oh, well, you have no standards of good and evil without God. So I don't need them. I'm talking about your theory. Your theory has a self-contradiction. Your theory leads to these results. And so that means you have to abandon the theory if you want to have a logically coherent, evidence-based worldview. And then they say, well, that's where I am. And then, of course, they'll say, well, then, gosh, that would be terrible. What do you do then if you have no moral standards? And I think that was something that you wanted to talk about today, too, is like, where do moral standards come from?
We'll get into that real quick. Before then, I wanted to talk about, since we're on the issue of compatibilism, I wanted to argue that I think compatibilism, the fact that everything happens of necessity, seems reasonable. Like, I don't think libertarian freedom is the truth. I'm kind of actually sympathetical with Edwards about the greatest desire determining the will. And I'll give a very brief example in an illustration.
I mean, it's almost tautological, actually, right? So if you're talking about in terms of neurophysics, it's a tautology. Your greatest desire is your will. That's it, right? Yeah. There is no separation between them.
Yeah, so to just give a brief example proving compatibilistic free will, John Gershner, the Calvinist theologian, he passed away a long time ago, he uses this example. I kind of modified it to make it more interesting. So suppose you're like, okay, I'm going to set out to disprove determinism. And then you think to yourself, okay, what's my greatest desire? You think, okay, my greatest desire, if you're a normal person, is to not hit yourself with a hammer. So you go, okay, so I'm going to go off of my lesser desire and like get a hammer and hit myself in the arm with a hammer, and you go like that, like, ow, all right. You're like, yes, I disproved determinism. But actually, you proved it because think about it. The desire to hit yourself in
Right.
the hammer to disprove determinism now outweighs the desire
Right.
to not hit yourself. And
Yeah.
so now
Yeah.
that's your greatest desire you're giving into now. How much it excites you for God not to be the cause of sin, blah, 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 to
Mhm.
disprove that. And now that's your greatest desire, hitting yourself with that. Before, it's our greatest desire. Now you're hitting yourself with the
Yeah.
hammer. So it's shifted. So what do you think about that?
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm infamously known as a compatibilist. I've taken to task libertarian free willers like Sam Harris, he's a determinist, right? So he's a hard determinist. He denies free will exists at all
Okay.
because he thinks there's only two kinds. There's either no free will or there's libertarian free will. He doesn't really have a good grasp of what compatibilist free will means. And I've written a lot on this. I've done a lot of, and I do it empirically too. I don't just do it from the armchair. So when I ask about these questions, like, well, what do we mean by free will? It's like, well, let's go look in the real world where it actually matters, right? So Supreme Court decisions, medical ethics boards. You can go into, there's a whole bunch of actual real world things where deciding whether free will existed or didn't actually affects human lives. Like there's actual decisions being made based on what you think about the presence or absence of free will. And when you go and look at those actual real world instances, it's always compatibilism. Always. So what they're looking for is always a compatibilist definition of free will, where they're not talking about free will as some sort of ability to defy causation. That's not relevant. It's simply exercise of autonomy. Do you know what you're doing? Is it what you wanted to do? And that's it, right? There's nothing else you would want, really, right? There's like the last thing you would want is to say that you have the greatest desire to do X, and then some weird thing goes in your head and you do Y instead, right? Which is what libertarian free will entails. It entails that you will frequently do what you don't want to do, which means that your will is broken, right? There's something, you're insane, right? Like that, you're actually talking about lunacy. So that no one should want that, right? You should always want to do what your greatest desire is. And then you know, how do you change someone's greatest desire is that you have to cause them to change it with information, right? So persuasion, you talk to them, you show them evidence, but your desire should be different. Here's why. You should want that. If you can't causally change people's dispositions by talking to them, then what's the point of even having the ability to even having intelligence to make decisions?
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
So compatibilism always plays out as what's really going on in the real world. Libertarian free will is just something people made up, largely to defend Christianity. It's largely a fabricated ivory tower.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, I think when you go into the analysis of it, libertarian free will is incoherent. Compatibilist free will makes complete sense of how we actually talk about free will in the real world. And that's it. You don't need anything else. So the conversation done, basically. So that's my take on it. And I've written a lot on this. People who are interested in that can go to my website, richardcarrier.info. My blog there. It has a drop-down menu for categories. Free will is one of them. You can go search.
Sweet, yeah. And it's like when you think about it, it's like, whether you're a man or an animal, you're always making choices to be in a different state than you were beforehand, and you're doing it to be in a better state. Well, either better in the evil sadistical sense or better in the righteous sense, or if you're an animal, better in the morally neutral sense. Like we're seeking to achieve more pleasure and achieve a more pleasurable state than we're in initially, So that would make sense that the greatest desire determining the will.
And it's always based on information, and information is always physically causal. So
there you go. Yep, sounds good. Alrighty, so that was good. So we talked about the problem of evil a little bit and libertarian freedom and compatibilism, and now we'll move on to, how we're talking about the moral argument. Where do atheists get their moral standard from? So where do you get your moral standard from, Richard Carrier?
Same place that all secular philosophers have. So I'm actually a neo-Aristotelian. So I actually follow. I don't agree with everything Aristotle said. Obviously, we've advanced hugely beyond him, but his fundamental understanding of how to talk about these things is often correct. So Aristotle's theory of morality, it needs a lot of filling out in a lot of other respects, but the basic idea of it is correct, which is that if you want to have the highest probability of living a fulfilling life, a satisfying life, you want to be satisfied with yourself, with who you are as a person, be comfortable with who you are. And if you want to have an environment that actually reacts well to you, right?
Exactly.
Then you have to behave a certain way. And if you don't, all these negative consequences, and these negative consequences that even according to your own selfish subjective standards are negative, right? So you don't need an external standard, right? So that it's really comes from that. And I think that the insight you have to get from this is that everyone who does engage in immoral behavior, of course, everybody who's doing immoral stuff, not everybody, but a lot of people who do immoral stuff claim that they're doing moral stuff, right? They try to rationalize what they're doing. And you can always say, like, well, how? So the Christian would say, well, how can you argue that they're wrong? But they always bring up Nazis to be an example. And you could say, well, actually, there's lots of things you can say. You don't have to be, in fact, that you have to say. Appealing to God doesn't do anything. Like, you can't go to a Nazi and say, God said you're wrong, and they're like, no, he didn't. God's with me, right? It's like, oh, fuck. Well, how do you resolve that argument, right? You have to appeal to evidence, and so you look at like a lot of what the Nazis were doing was based on beliefs about the world that are empirically false, right? So you can say, well, look, let's just clean house of all your false beliefs, right? Let's get you back into correct, true beliefs about the world, and then let's see which one of your moral propositions survive that. And a lot of them won't, right? So a lot of Nazism gets dissolved the moment you actually get right with you're drawing conclusions from actual true facts. And then the next thing is desires, right? Like, what is it that you want? And this is where Aristotle really did the right thing that I think we need to like teach more often. People need to do this. Is that Aristotle said, well, look, you have a certain number of desires, but why do you want those things, right? You should critically examine your desires and say, like, well, why do you want that? Why do you want that? And he says, whenever you ask that question, you always come up with some reason. So there's some other thing that you want that the other thing gets you, right? So you want money because you want food. Right? It's food, right? And I said, well, why do you want food? And then, so you keep going down the line of it, and it's like, why do you want these things? And what you end up with is Aristotle's going in the opposite direction, ending up with the same thing as Maslow's hierarchy. And I recommend people go Google that, Maslow's hierarchy, if you don't know it already. It ties into a lot of the science of moral theory today, but it's basically just a scientific realization of what Aristotle's talking about, is when you get to the bottom of all the things that you want, really it's to be satisfied with yourself and satisfied with your life. That's basically it. A lot of people translate it as happiness. That's not exactly a correct translation. Aristotle said eudaimonia, which means good spirit. And that has a different valence than the English word happiness, but it's closer to satisfaction or fulfillment or contentment or something like that. And that is the thing. That is the one thing you want for itself. You don't want it for some other reason. And that is the one thing that you wouldn't sacrifice for anything else, right? Anytime you're sacrificing contentment, you're doing it in the belief that you will achieve even greater future contentment, right? You think that somehow this is going to you're going to upgrade if you can go through this struggle, right? And so that's what everybody thinks. So and that's a question of, and they're correct, right? Is basically right. So the question is that you also interrogate your desires, and so you're not the average Nazi has sometimes very disordered desires. Like, their desires do not logically follow. They actually self-conflict or conflict with their own greater desires, and they're just not aware of this. And you can actually show, like, your desires are out of sync. And if you actually get right, you actually align your desires with your greatest desire, which is personal contentment and life contentment, and then align that with factual reality, what you end up with is not Nazism. What you end up with is a condemnation of Nazism. And so, the thing is like, not only is this our foundation, this is how atheists talk about morality. You never have to appeal to God. But the point is that this is the only actual successful way you can talk about morality. Like, because the idea that you have to base morality in the nature of God or in the commands of God is completely, utterly useless. It has absolutely no persuasive value. Because you have no evidence, first of all, that God even has those values. Secondly, as opposed to other values. So that's why the Nazi can always say, well, God's with me, not with you, end of argument, right? And so, well, what do? You're stuck.
Divine command theory.
Right. What will happen, of course, is Christians will start appealing to evidence. They'll start appealing to the logical incoherence of their desires, exactly what we're doing, right? So they end up doing the same thing, and then just try to put God on top of it, which doesn't get you anywhere. The God part doesn't get you anywhere. And so that's the thing that I think is the most important about this, is that going around trying to claim that you have to base morality in God is really just a covert way of trying to push your subjective morality on other people, rather than actually trying to argue for what actually is moral. Like, trying to figure out, like, what would be a moral God? What would a moral God look like? And you can't appeal to just, you can't say, well, moral God looks like what God actually is, because you have no access to what the moral values of God actually are, right? So it's just like, well, let's say you don't know any of this stuff, and you're going around. Let's suppose you have this weird existential choice. Suddenly, like 5 gods pop up, and you have to choose which one sticks around, right? And how do you choose? You can't choose based on the nature of God because there's 5 different ones and they're all equal. What do you do? How do you choose? How do you choose one of those gods as the good God and the others as not?
Yeah.
If you can't answer that question, then you can never answer the question of what is moral and why. And so Christians are really just dodging the question. They're not really answering it. And I think that's a bigger problem for society than atheism just admitting where morality comes from. And let's just get into the nitty gritty of factual reality and human desires, and let's just talk about it. Just because that's the only thing you can talk about, really. It's the only way you're actually going to make the world a better place.
Yep. Alrighty, very good information, Dr. Carrier. And then to go into our last topic, and we kind of got into it a little bit already, is divine command theory. And I just want to start off by saying there's a new Christian trend going on, and I've seen it in some even not just hyper-Calvinist circles, but classical Calvinist circles, where they will say, as one website said, I was utterly shocked when I saw this. He was like, the author was like, Calvinists tend to deny that God's the author of sin, and they argue this. Even if he is the efficient cause of sin, he'd be good. And I'm just like, oh my God. And I've seen that like on a lot of sites, and this view is known as equal ultimacy. In the same way he inspires evil in people, inspires good. And if you go up to them and say, yeah, what's a standard? You're like, well, divine command theory. God says to be the cause of sin, so it's good for him to be the cause of sin. It's only a sin for us to be the cause of sin because he gave us the law prohibiting us. But in order for him to sin, he had to give a law unto himself. And as long as he doesn't give a law unto himself, he can be the cause of sin. It's just ridiculous.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, divine command theory does leave you in that pickle, right? That's what's the problem. That's one of many problems with it, but that's one of the problems with it. I have an article on this too on divine command theory. It was Flanagan, the Christian apologist. I can't remember his first name. His last name's Flanagan, but he did a defense of divine command theory against I want to say Walter Sinan Armstrong. Now I'm blanking on who it was, but an ethical naturalist, and he didn't have time to write the reply, so I actually wrote the reply in the peer-reviewed journal Philo, and then I wrote a blog analyzing the fallout from that, and so that you can find that on my blog as well, richardcarrier.info. But I go into all of these points about divine command theory, including the one you just mentioned, and then I go into various other aspects of what's wrong with it, why it doesn't work, and yeah, it does come down to
cause and sin. I just think that's the exact opposite of what you do if you're good.
Yeah, no, but that's what you have to say, right? You have to come down to say, well, if God wants to kill millions of people for some stupid reason, then that's moral because that's what God wants. And so that sort of divorces the definitions of good and evil from anything to do with actual human happiness or well-being, right? So you're basically like how humans feel, like our satisfaction with life, our fulfillment, our contentment, our happiness, irrelevant. Right? It's like, is it irrelevant? It's not, right? Like there's literally nothing that matters more than human well-being. So if you base your morality on a complete disregard of human well-being, well, then you're not talking about morality anymore. You're just talking about
just arbitrary decision making.
Right. Like I said, barbarism. It's just savagery. Like there's no attendance to the welfare or well-being of humans at all in that, and that's. You can't have, if that's your definition of morality, you're already a sociopath, and then we have concerns about you.
Yeah.
That's the problem we have, and I really hate that that's theology that leads people to that place. If you weren't a believer in God, you wouldn't be saddling yourself with these sort of disturbingly immoral false beliefs, and so that's one of many problems I have with Christianity.
Yeah. And like going on what you're saying, like it doesn't take an Einstein to figure out that racism isn't wrong because God says it's wrong. Racism is wrong because, like you said, you're being very disrespectful to people, and the effects it will have on them merely for the color of their skin is going to be ridiculous. Like it's just skin color, you can't.
Well, I mean, I pointed out in my article.
You're right. That's morality,
I pointed out in my article with Brierley, this is another example, like it goes back to us talking about Nazis. Like you don't even need a moral critique of racism because you can completely destroy it epistemically.
Yeah. Right?
You can just say it's just false, right? like racist beliefs are just false. And you can prove that empirically.
True. Yes.
But yes, with regard to the moral aspect would be, does it make sense to treat people poorly because of some arbitrary reason. And you can show that. But yeah, if you were to iterate that view and that behavior throughout your society would suck for you. And lo and behold, look at all of the problems that we have as a result of racism. They come back and impact even the racists, right? So, the racists are constantly complaining about crime. They say, like, yeah, well, there's a lot of racist decisions have actually increased crime in inner city neighborhoods, right? Mm-hmm. Your racism is responsible for this. If we had a more equalitarian society, we wouldn't have those inner city slum problems. And so this is so it's like there's a whole social system here that you have to take into account. But there's also just your personal self-view. Mm-hmm. It's like if let's say, this is a classic example. You have the racist. What if the racist is suddenly now the target of racism, which they often complain that they actually are, right? And suddenly now racism is bad when it's targeting them, right? Now
you can't have a double standard.
Let's
bad against you, bad against the other.
Let's not get into the epistemic question of whether really they are victims of racism. Let's assume they are. And I'll give an example. I actually was once. I was targeted for being white by black people. And this was, I could tell a whole story as to why that was. There's a historical causal reason for it. But I was in a neighborhood that has a particularly long-standing resentment of white people. It goes back to World War II. It's a long history there. And I was riding my bike through there, and I had racial slurs thrown at me. What are you doing in our town, honky? That kind of stuff. Cracker, whitey. I had bottles thrown at me. I'm sure I would have been more viciously assaulted had I not pedaled out of there batshit fast. So there I am. I'm attacked for racist reasons, for the color of my skin. So it's a legitimate claim. Yeah. But that sucks, right? So, yeah. I can have a moral, but not just a moral judgment, but just a personal judgment of I don't like those people who treated me that way. I think. Yeah. Right. So if I don't like them, and I become like them, I start doing the same thing they're doing, then I can't like myself, right? I wouldn't like myself. I wouldn't be comfortable with who I was. If I want to be the sort of person that I like and admire, I have to actually be the sort of person I like and admire, and that would be someone who wouldn't act like that. So that rules out racism. I can't be a racist because I wouldn't be comfortable with myself if I were. Now, the usual bypass of this is that people develop delusional beliefs to deny what's actually going on. So they'll be a racist and they'll rationalize it. But that gets us back to false beliefs. And so you can actually epistemically show that those are false beliefs. And you can show that you have false beliefs about yourself. If you can get past those false beliefs, you will realize that you're behaving in exactly the same way that you find abhorrent. And you would find yourself abhorrent if you realized it. And it's that moment, that's when people become non-racist. It's when they're anti-racist. It's when they change their mind and actually become a moral person, is when they have that moment of realization, is like, oh my God, I'm a person I despise. And that's the moment. And you have to get people to that moment to really get people to change from an immoral stance to a moral stance.
Yes, very good. Yep. And just going on, the laws of God, even in the Bible, some Christians complained about the laws of God, like Peter during the Council of Jerusalem, where he's like, hey, James, let's not make these Gentiles have an uneasy yoke that even our forefathers weren't able to bear. We need to cut out this dick cutting. And he's well, I mean, this sounds like we're going into uncharted territory here, giving so much liberty to the Gentiles, but we got to do it because it's like, let's just make the Christian faith as easy as possible. So we'll just say baptism replaces circumcision and, don't eat meat to idols and don't have sex with, Gentile prostitutes and you're good, I mean, they complained. I was like, let's just abolish this circumcision. Gone. Who cares that?
And it works the other way around too, that we're talking about racism. There's actually no actual condemnation of racism in the Bible. There's actually an endorsement of racism in the Bible. I think it's Ezra. It's one of those books around there where they talk about banning interracial marriage. Right, so and it's endorsed as something that God approves of, and so so if you're going to go talk, and this is the other problem I pointed out with Brierley, is that he has all these really high moral ideals. He says, "Oh God, we have to get these moral ideals from God," and it's like he doesn't seem to even be aware that none of those moral ideals are actually in the Bible. In fact, the Bible preaches against them. Like he talks about racism. Well, racism there's pro-racism in the Bible. Talking about like slavery. The Bible is consistently pro-slavery, right? Right. You talk about like equality. He made a big deal about equality, like equality of women. I'm like, oh my God, let's talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2, right? The complete subordination of women and a demolition of women's rights. Like your Bible is evil according to your own standards. And I think, and they try to dodge that by saying, well, you can't judge the Bible without the standard. And I was like, no, I'm using your standards to judge the Bible. I'm saying, according to your standards, even your Bible is false, and so you shouldn't be adopting that religion. And so this is the problem. I think a lot of Christians don't reason through. They're not aware of it, and when they become aware of it, it becomes very uncomfortable, and they try to get away from it. Like cognitive dissonance, they try to either ditch the argument, like go somewhere else and evade you, or they come up with some sort of apologetic to like deny what they've just learned and so on, which is a common behavior of delusionality in general. You see it in QAnon, you see it in flat earthers. It's the same kind of stuff.
Alrighty, well, very good discussion we just had here, Dr. Carrier. We covered a lot of topics.
Yeah, we really did.
Good amount of time. Little history of all these important topics in this little talk we had. So people will be very happy that they got so much diversity out of this. Alrighty, well, just to close off, thank you everyone for tuning into this. The name of my paper is God is Either the Efficient or Final Cause of Evil. You can just type that in. And Dr. Carrier, I'll let you take it away. Did you want to promote yourself? Any books, any activities?
Yeah. Well, I teach online courses on a lot of subjects, history and philosophy, including this one. And counter apologetics in general, but also science and philosophy of moral reasoning, and free will. I have a course on the science and philosophy of free will. So and many others. And you can find those. You go to my website, richardcarrier.info. There's take classes as one of the links in the menu at the top. You can go exploring what classes I offer. They're just simple 1-month classes. They're not very expensive. There's not a lot to do. It's mostly just reading, some thinking, some answering questions. And then, most importantly, if you're a student, you've paid the registration, you're doing the student for a month, you get the whole month to bug me with all the questions that you have about that subject in the online forum. I use Google Groups for this. So if you want to ask someone who's published expert in these fields, that's the thing to do. So I recommend those. And then, of course, everything else I do, blogging, my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, my books, if you want to check those out. I've got a lot of them now. All of that stuff it's warehoused in the same place. So richardcarrier.info has all things me, and you can start there.
And I just wanted to say everyone should check out his book, Jesus from Outer Space.
Let me grab that. Wait, do I have it here? Yes, here it is.
A short read. A little, summarized.
Wait, is that coming through backwards? Or is that just me?
It's showing the front, yeah.
Good, okay.
Bright and shiny.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That is, and it's a short read too. So
50 pages,
and it has a concordance to the much longer academic peer-reviewed monograph, which is much larger.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So if you want, you can enjoy reading the simple book that's just the basics and colloquially written, and it's fun. It's a fun read. But if you want to do the deeper dive and the questions in there, you can use the concordance and go to the original academic monograph. So it's a useful tool as well as enjoyable reading. So I highly recommend it.
My favorite part of the book is when you're quoting Christian theologians like N.T. Wright saying, the evidence of Jesus is pretty much as sound as the evidence of Julius Caesar. You're like, all right, let's see how that one works out. And then it's like, the evidence of Jesus is as good as Spartacus. Yes. It's like, well, really? Let's see how that one works out.
Yeah, right. I have a whole chapter.
I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on that where I find these actual quotes where they made these outrageous claims. And I go, well, let's examine this. And that's important because it shows you why are we confident that Spartacus was a historical person?
Yeah,
there's a reason.
I know it goes into
and those reasons do not apply to Jesus. That's why I'm skeptical. But anyway, for people who want that, I have a whole chapter on just many examples of historical personages that Christians have made these comparisons with. And so let's make that comparison. Let's actually make the comparison. We will learn a lot from that. And I go through the whole chapter doing that.
Yep, and then his book on the historicity of Jesus was the very first peer-reviewed book on the topic of the non-existence of Jesus that passed hard standards.
Yeah, that would be the one I just pulled up, that big heavy monograph one. And then there's been a second since then, which is Raphael Lasser, which we mentioned earlier at the top. So his book, Questioning the Historicity of Jesus, is the other one, and that's published by Brill, which is an even more prestigious academic press.
Awesome. Alrighty. Well, thank you, Dr. Carrier, for being on again. And in a little bit, I will give you this link. You can share it on Twitter, share it wherever you want.
You bet.
Alrighty. Thank you.
Alrighty.